Let's now go over to Glenn Greenwald in Rio in Brazil. Glenn, thanks for being with us on this, happy occasion. I would say, from my personal perspective, that Julian is now on his way to Australia. You have been following the story for many, many years. You know the details of it. What are your thoughts now when Julian is now taking his final leg to freedom and will walk as a free man on Australian soil?
Yeah, I think the first time I wrote about Julian was back in 2008. I interviewed him at the time. That was obviously 2 years even before the Iraq and Afghanistan war logs publication. And I remember writing that article describing why Julian was a prescient pioneer and actually heroic in terms of the project he was creating. So I feel like I saw that value from the beginning and have never stopped not only seeing it, but supporting it. And of course, have developed a personal friendship with Julian, personal feelings for him and immense respect for him and Stella. And, just as a personal matter, as a human level, it's so fulfilling and gratifying to see him actually walk outside of that prison. I think a lot of us who were hoping for it for so long didn't believe it would actually come true. And now to see it, it still almost doesn't feel real. I think, though, that beyond the human aspect of it and the happiness that you suggested, you're feeling on that end that I think I'm sharing as well, it's a little bit bittersweet, in part because he did effectively end up losing 14 or 15 years of his life in effective captivity, the worst of which was the last 5 years when he was actually in a high security prison that the BBC calls Guantanamo, the British Guantanamo. And all this time, he had never been convicted of a single crime other than a misdemeanor of bail jumping, which they claimed he committed when he sought his legal right of asylum in Ecuador and didn't show up in court, gave him a 51-week sentence that he's obviously served years ago. And so to remember that he's been in effective detention for 15 years for the crime of doing journalism, it's aged as well. And then on top of that, what the U.S. government did so vindictively in forcing him to plead guilty to one count, even though had they just dropped the case, it would have been exactly the same thing because he's obviously walking out that same day, I think is extremely disturbing because what they were, of course, worried about is that they would be perceived as admitting that Julian's imprisonment all these years was wrongful, but that also it would, in a sense, send a signal in the future to would-be whistleblowers or publishers that have done what Julian did, that even the U.S. government acknowledges that there's no criminal liability. And that, I think, is the thing that concerns or should concern people who care about press freedom the most is what will the U.S. government try and exploit or extract as a message of precedent. There's no legal precedent to the plea bargain, but there can be cultural or political influences on how the Justice Department treats future cases, on the message that is sent to other people who would want to confront the U.S. security state and blow the whistle on their secret crimes. So all of these things, I think, are things we have to try and understand and process. Obviously, they're complex questions. Can't really fully analyze them in less than 24 hours since hearing the news. We haven't seen the plea bargain, the plea agreement yet. All those things are very important to understand the details of. But in general, the two impressions I have are, extreme happiness that the saga has finally ended, that Julian's reunited with his wife and children, that he's a free man on his way back, presumably to Australia. And then number two, it was and it remains the worst attack on press freedom in the West in many decades.
I mean, it's been extraordinary to be a part of this, and the sort of vindictive persistence in just harming Julian, as it feels. I mean, the resistance to give in, and it's almost like you could sense that there were forces in the political level in the U.S. that surely wanted, and we know that, surely wanted this to go away because it was an uncomfortable, especially for the Biden administration, uncomfortable scenario to have Julian in the situation. So what what drives this? What forces are driving this sort of vindictive crusade against Julian, just to let him pay a very heavy price for committing the crime of journalism?
Yeah, well, I don't want to rush and skip over that first part of your question, that premise there, because for me, one of the most repulsive parts of this entire event is that it was always clear to me that the US government had no interest in bringing Julian to the US to stand trial. I've said this repeatedly, that it was almost impossible to imagine, especially, say, Joe Biden, bringing Julian to the Eastern District of Virginia, having this incredible circus around that attempt to extradite and then prosecute him, but also the danger of putting him on the stand, the things that he might say, the things they would have to disclose to him and his defense team. But most of all, the spectacle that Joe Biden would be the first American president in history to preside over the attempt to imprison not a leaker of information inside the government, but a publisher of information, someone who received it, like the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Guardian do every day. But this would be the first time that anyone in that capacity would go to prison for it. And so you had this attempt on the one hand to pretend that they wanted to extradite Julian because they knew that would result in his imprisonment for as long as they possibly could keep him in prison, but never really the intention to actually extradite him and bring him here, because nothing could ever be in their interest. And on top of that, they would have risked that a court would have ruled that, in fact, everything Julian Assange was accused of doing was constitutionally protected and did not constitute a crime and could never constitute a crime. They were petrified of that kind of precedent that would be devastating to them. So this is one of the most rotted parts of everything that happened. Was he was in prison because of a fraud that the US government was pretending to want to bring him to the US, when in fact they had no intention to do so. Now, as far as the broader implications are concerned, the most important part of this to me has always been that the theory that they use, that the Trump administration used to indict Julian, is a theory that by its very nature is designed to criminalize all investigative journalism. And I think one of the things that has been forgotten is, I remember I wrote an article, an op-ed in the Washington Post when the indictment was published, explaining why the conduct they were accusing him of engaging in, encouraging his source to avoid detection, encouraging his source to provide more information, is something that investigative journalists do every single day. And if that's a crime, you could charge any investigative journalist with the crime. And I wrote that article about a month or two before I was contacted by a source in Brazil that enabled me to do, very consequential reporting. And at the end of that, the Brazilian government also tried to prosecute me. I was indicted as well, using a theory almost identical to the one that the US government had used for Julian. And through a lot of luck and happenstance, I ended up with the Supreme Court protecting me and saying I could be prosecuted under that theory because it was an attack on free press. But it showed how all journalists, meaning real journalists, like journalists who don't carry a message of a government, but who investigate it and scrutinize it and expose the secrets that they want to keep concealed, those kind of journalists, real journalists, all of them would be endangered by the theory that the indictment was based on.
When we have a chance to actually scrutinize the plea document, it screams out to you that, these sentences that they are referring to, and we've seen this before, which is supposed to be sort of underscoring and proving the malign intention of the journalists getting the source to break the law. And the most infamous one is the one line from Julian, quote unquote, curious eyes never run dry in my experience. And so that's a crime. So it's a crime if you're a journalist, basically, if your source says, I think I'm giving you everything I can. And then, are you sure you can't? There's nothing more? And voila, you're guilty. You could end up in jail. It's almost surreal to imagine.
Well, there are two aspects to that. If I can just interject, because I think it's the most important part. One is, the one aspect was that they were accusing him of trying to help his source evade detection, kind of orienting her and counseling her about things she should do and shouldn't do. to avoid leaving tracks, and that somehow he became a co-conspirator with her by giving her that advice. That's exactly the theory the Brazilian government tried to use to prosecute me, that when I oriented my sources about how to avoid detection, that made me part of the conspiracy. And then the other aspect, which was also part of my indictment, that they based the indictment of Julian on, was exactly what you just said, that there was an encouragement to say, oh, this is really great, this information you brought me, could you maybe get this and this and this? And I can tell you, there's, first of all, if you go to the front page of the New York Times or the Washington Post or any major media outlet, they now have instructions for sources who want to leak classified information, telling them how not to get caught. And if a source called you on your phone and said, hey, I'm a source and I want to give you information, the first thing any ethical journalist would do is say, don't call me on an open phone, use Signal or use encryption or whatever. You would help the person not to get caught. But the other thing is, I don't know of a single journalist in the world who would have a source come to them and be given information who wouldn't say, oh, could you maybe also get this to strengthen the story? Is there a way you could get this to shed light on this? This is the basic stuff of investigative journalism, which this indictment attempted to criminalize.
Yeah, and it's still that's an element that will still linger on because that's an indictment. Of course, all the allegation of this baseless hacking charge is gone. There's no trace of that. Well, they call it hacking charge. It actually wasn't even alleged hacking, but conspiracy to commit hacking. So. It's just bizarre, and all these elements were torn apart in the extradition proceedings in London, in the London courtrooms, and it got way too little attention. How little by little it was dissected and exposed by former Pentagon computer experts, etc. That there was nothing there. And if, from my perspective, I mean, I'm so discouraged by the fact that it didn't get more attention. So which brings me maybe to that question overall. Why did our colleagues not pay more attention to this very important case for their interest?
Right. So I do want to address the media attitude toward the Assange prosecution, but you asked me a question that I didn't really answer, that I just thought of, that I want to just address quickly because it's also so important. You asked me, what was the motive in trying to be so vindictive in Julian's case? If you look back at people who have leaked classified information, who the U.S. security state hated, people like Daniel Ellsberg, who they tried to put in prison for life, Chelsea Manning, who they tortured and kept in very harsh prison conditions for almost a decade, and were angry at President Obama for commuting her sentence. Obviously, Edward Snowden, who can't come back to the United States, and if he stepped one foot outside Russia, he'd immediately go to a U.S. dungeon. And also with Julian, all of these people, by the time they were trying to destroy them, had lost their access to classified information. Obviously, they had no more ability to do anything that the U.S. government regarded as harmful. They had no more ability to spill secrets. So the question was, why were they so obsessed with destroying their lives? And the reason is because the U.S. security state has a vulnerability that Julian, I think, was the first person to really identify, which is one of the things that makes him so pioneering, which is that the one thing they cannot prevent, they build this wall of secrecy around them, but the one thing they can't prevent are people inside their own agencies concluding that what they're doing is so wrong that these people feel a conscious driven need to risk their own security in their lives to leak it. And in the digital age, it's easier than ever to simply transport huge amounts of information from these agencies in a very short amount of time. And so what they're obsessed with doing, knowing they can't stop that, is to try and scare every future Edward Snowden, Daniel Ellsberg, Chelsea Manning, Julian Assange, people who would expose the secret crimes of the U.S. government. And it's very important to them to send the message, if you do that, look at how we will destroy your life forever. We will do whatever we can to make sure that you have no heroes welcome, that you never walk free. Obviously, Daniel Ellsberg escaped that. He almost went to prison only because of government misconduct, but that's their motive for sure. And then the issue of the media, it's really interesting, Kristinn, because when Julian first and WikiLeaks did its first leak that really put them on the media map in 2010, there was a fair amount of media support for them. One of the things Julian, of course, did was partner with the New York Times and the Guardian and multiple other media outlets around the world to kind of make it that the media, the corporate media, was part of that process. And then even once there was an attempt to prosecute him, there was a lot of support for Julian on the liberal left in the West. A lot of Western liberals, Western leftists were highly supportive of Julian Assange. And there was a lot of media support for him too. What changed, and it's by far the biggest factor that changed, was the perception that in 2016, the reporting Julian did of fully authentic and genuine documents helped somehow Hillary Clinton lose and Donald Trump win because the documents reflected poorly on Hillary Clinton. And that was the one thing they could not forgive. That was by the point when there was all this hysteria about Russia. And in their minds, Julian not only was responsible in large part for Hillary's defeat and Trump's victory, but also had in their minds became what everyone who becomes they disagree with, which is an agent of the Kremlin or a Russian asset or whatever. And from that point on, Julian became a political prisoner. They wanted him in prison because not because of anything that he did in 2010, but because of what he did in the 2016 election, doing reporting that affected negatively on Hillary Clinton. And it was at that point that the media decided that they were happy to see him wasting away in prison. And I think there's also obviously a major perception that there are certain journalists who are real journalists and who are the inside people who work for large corporate outlets. And then there are people who aren't part of their club, independent journalists like Julian, who they had no problem trying to write out of journalism and to say, well, yeah, of course, we're happy if he's prosecuted, but we would never want, and we don't believe we'll ever see this precedent being applied to one of us. And that was absolutely part of what made the US media either entirely indifferent or even supportive of Julian's prosecution. Of course, occasionally you had some people objecting to Julian's indictment, but that was usually only because it was the Trump administration that did it and they got to use that Trump angle. But once it was the Biden administration responsible for this last 4 years of Julian's wasting away in prison, very, very little attention was paid to it because there was no partisan angle they could extract from it. And I think they were happy more or less to see Julian wasting away in a dungeon, which is to their internal disgrace.
Yeah, it has been remarkable. I've had this discussion with so many journalists about this 2016, which I was not a part of. I was not part of the organization for that period of time. When you ask people, so what is a journalist supposed to do just before a very important election when he gets information about that is obviously in the public interest to publish? What are you suggesting? Well, and people actually will suggest, well, they should wait and not interrupt the process. And I would say, well, what is? How do you see your role then in the as this base in the democratic process? And what is your role? Isn't it to inform the public about the choices? I mean, you are basically taking a decision to corrupt the process if you decide to sit on information that could be valuable for the people to make up their minds about the choices they have. And people always, then that sort of the partisan element sort of comes in there, and people, journalists will sort of reluctantly admit that, but still, it's just amazing, and it just doesn't cease to amaze me. People just people can square that,
Yeah, and the critique of Julian was a complete abandonment of the core values of journalism as it was understood for decades. In so many ways, in the age of Trump, they were willing to do that. I mean, one of the core principles of journalism is that if you have a source that gives you authentic documents in the public interest, you don't care about the source. You don't care where they got it from or how they got it. You don't care what their motives are. Your only job as a journalist is to ask two questions. Are these documents authentic? Are they in the public interest to publish? And if the answer is yes, you publish them. And I'll just give you one quick example to show the disgusting hypocrisy they used against Julian, which was in 2015, the New York Times received by mail copies of Donald Trump's tax returns. They had no idea who put it in the mailbox, obviously had no idea who the source was. They don't know if the source broke the law, as is likely to get those tax returns, nor did they know the source's motive. And yet once they authenticated it, they published it anyway. And NPR asked the New York Times reporter Why would you publish documents when you have no idea who the source is or what their motives are? And the journalist who's won 2 Pulitzers, David Barstow, explained, as a journalist, we don't care who our sources are. Some of the best sources have the worst motives. So I think there was this idea that it's not that Julian shouldn't have published those documents because it was during an election, more so that because it came from hacking, allegedly, or that because it was a foreign government providing those documents, that meant that Julian shouldn't have published them. Now, obviously, if let's say the Venezuelan government or the Iranian government had hacked harmful information about Trump and then handed that to media outlets, every single one of them would have published the harmful information about Trump, even though it might have come from Iran or Venezuela or hacking or whatever. That's always been the core value of journalism, but they completely abandoned it in the case of Trump and especially in the case of Julian.
You talked earlier about whistleblowers, and I mean the idea that you have to send a warning signal that if you will pay a price, and it's so incredibly contrary to, for example, you could still find when Obama was running for office the first time, he was actually campaigning on supporting whistleblowers and create a base. We need whistleblowers, he said, and then of course he turned out to be the president with the honor of sitting over an administration that overused the espionage against whistleblower more than all other presidents combined. It was just ironic. But what do you think will be the long-term effect on whistleblowers? I mean, I'm always amazed how principled people are. We talk about motives. Yes, they can be motives that are spurious. But I'm always amazed that people will take this risk, that are driven from this internal desire to do right and to correct wrong. Do you fear that this era is over, or will they keep coming?
I think the goal of the U.S. security state in trying to crush Julian was to bring it to an end. And I don't worry that it will work, because if you look at all of human history, it is driven by people who were so impassioned and impelled by a certain cause that they believed was right, that they've always been willing to sacrifice their own interest, their own liberty, even their own life in defense of that principle. And although that's rare for people to do, and that's why we celebrate it when it happens as heroic and as noble, precisely because it's rare. Most human beings are self-interested and don't prioritize anything above their self-interest. But the ones who do, the ones who place some kind of cause or injustice or fighting for a principle above their own self-interest, those people have existed in history for all of recorded history, and I think will always continue to. There are just certain people who, based on the culture, how their personality is constructed, when they confront a certain injustice, they feel so compelled to combat it. I mean, one of the things I heard from Ellsberg and from Julian and Snowden and Chelsea Manning all in common was that they understood the acts that they were undertaking could result in their life imprisonment or their death. And I remember Snowden always emphasizing, in particular, saying that the pain and shame that he would have to live with his entire life of knowing he had the opportunity to expose all of this wrongdoing, but because of cowardice, he failed to. The pain of knowing that about himself would be far worse than anything that they could do to him, including putting him in prison or killing him. And I really believe that's what motivated him. I believe that's what motivated Julian. Of course, Julian understood the risk very, very well, and other people as well. So it's a human attribute that appears, thankfully, throughout history in different cultures and different eras. And I don't think the U.S. government will have the ability to crush it completely.
Yeah, well, that's encouraging. Let's really hope so. Julian has paid a big price for being principled. I've been encouraged him for a long time to seek this avenue, and I can say here that he resisted that. But and I'm certain. Well, especially after the outcome in our court proceedings in London in May, that he would eventually have been able to cause this extradition. But the process could have taken up to 5 years. If you think about appeal process, if the American DOJ would be pushing hard, it would have been ended possibly in the European Court of Human Rights. It takes years and years and years. It would have been so prolonged. There are people that are criticizing Julian for taking this decision. What do you say to them?
I'm sorry. Unless somebody has done what Julian has done, has taken the risk he's taken, has deliberately subjected themselves to the huge costs and risks that Julian did, there is nobody who has any kind of standing to question or object to Julian's decision to rejoin his wife and family. He has children for whom he's responsible. He has suffered enormously. I mean, this was not a joke of a prison that he was in. As you know, it was a maximum security prison. He was in his cell 23 hours a day, a 3x2 meter cell. He, even before that, those 8 or 7 years in the Ecuadorian embassy were themselves full of all kinds of deprivation. And anybody who wants to stand up and question or complain about Julian's decision, before I'm willing to hear a word that they have to say in that regard, needs to demonstrate to me that they themselves have done what they're demanding Julian do, before I think they have any credit. It's very easy to demand other people sacrifice more of their life and take greater risks, when you yourself have never demonstrated a willingness to do that.
So true. And now we can celebrate that Julian is on his way to freedom, and finally, and let's hope he has a time to recuperate and get his life back. It was so good to talk to you, Glenn. Thanks for being with us.
Yeah, it's so great to share this day with you. I know you've been at this for a long time, obviously been crucial to WikiLeaks and to Julian. So I'm very happy for you and everyone over at WikiLeaks as well. And I appreciate you asking me to talk to you.
Thank you much. Thank you much.
All right. Have a good day.